Excellent. Welcome, everybody, and thank you to today's webinar. I am really excited to be joined by Kyle and Kylie from Tapestry Community Capital. My name is Mel Willerth. I am the Senior Manager of Education with Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, and we run webinars year-round trying to inform the housing sector about what's new, what's upcoming, what can be learned, connecting each other to one another. I want to take a brief moment to acknowledge that I'm currently actually here in Ottawa. I need to learn what Ottawa is because I live in Edmonton, what's colonially known as Edmonton, which is Treaty 6 territory there in Musketawiskaiken. And I think it's important as we're constantly talking about, housing as a human right, that we also acknowledge that the land that we're on is Indigenous land. So once again, thank you, Kylie and Kyle for coming. We are going to have the chat function working. We're going to have the Q&A section working. And I'm going to introduce Kyle and then turn it over to him. So Kyle leads business development at Tapestry Community Capital, which is a nonprofit cooperative that aims to democratize access to capital for nonprofits, cooperatives, and charities by enabling these organizations to finance projects on their own terms. He educates new clients about alternative financing solutions like the community bond and guides them through the initial onboarding process before launching an investment campaign. Kyle also leads the impact measurement function at Tapestry. Since graduating from York University with a degree in finance, he has held various roles in the social impact sector, including strategy, social enterprise development, fundraising, impact measurement, and community engagement. Thanks so much, Kyle, and I'm going to pass it over to you.
Thanks, Mel. It's great to be here, everyone. Thanks for making the time out of your day. And yeah, I'm excited to tell you a little bit more about our financing solution, the community bond. So yeah, just very quickly before I start, if you have any questions, feel free to enter them in the chat. Kylie will be active on there and she can answer any questions. And I will also address any outstanding questions at the end of my presentation. So without further ado, I'll just share my slides. So a little bit more about Tapestry as an organization. We were founded in 2018. We were founded as a nonprofit cooperative in 2018 by our parent company, the Toronto Renewable Energy Cooperative. So it all started with a wind turbine project in downtown Toronto in the early 2000s. And ever since then, a lot of other nonprofits, charities, and co-ops reached out to us to say, hey, how do we replicate this model of community finance for our project and our sector? And that's how Tapestry was born to really be that North Star and guide for a lot of these organizations. And so we're on a mission to make community financing accessible to all social purpose organizations in Canada. And we guide issuers every step of the way to ensure that you're able to meet your investment raise targets and complete your project. To date, we've successfully advised our issuers to raise over $129 million from 4,300 investors to finance more than 70 meaningful community projects in sectors like affordable housing, renewable energy, arts and culture, among others. And so the challenge we're addressing is twofold. The first is recognizing that there are a lot of nonprofits, charities, and co-ops who want to acquire assets and scale their impact, but they need access to capital. They don't have the same access to financing like their private enterprise counterparts, and they need alternative solutions. The second challenge that we're addressing is that there are individuals and institutions who want to invest their money in positive ways, but they don't quite know where to start and what that investment vehicle looks like. And so the solution that we work with is the community bond. If you're hearing this term for the first time, a community bond is essentially a loan that organizations borrow from individual community members, local businesses, foundations, anyone across the country can invest in your community bond. And this is a tool used exclusively by nonprofits, charities, and co-ops. The reason why it's such a great tool and why we've seen so much traction is because organizations are able to set their own financing terms. So unlike traditional financing, where it is very prescriptive, the bank provides a quote on the rate they're willing to loan to you at, depending on your risk profile. With the community bond, that power dynamic is flipped. in where you as the nonprofit or charity get to set your own interest rate, get to set your own term length, get to set your own investment minimums. So it's really bespoke financing for exactly what you need. And the graphic on the right really shows the circular nature of the community bond, where you as the issuer will issue a community bond. Community members will purchase the bond. Once enough community members have purchased the bond, you will be able to finance your project. And through that capital project is how you'll typically be able to repay those bondholders over time. And even when the bond matures, if there are other projects in the pipeline, especially in housing, where there's constantly new developments, there's always the option for investors to reinvest their capital with you and continue supporting you into the future. And so the three key benefits that we see with this model is that community investors are able to make a fair return by investing in projects that they believe in. Number two would be nonprofits and co-ops are able to own their assets and scale their impact to ensure their long-term sustainability. And then number three is that communities are overall better served with access to the spaces and services that they need. And so why should you consider issuing a community bond? Well, number one, like I said, they're
Hey, everybody, just checking to see if it's muted or if it's frozen for everybody else as well. I can see people saying, yep, it's frozen. Okay, let's hope that Kyle gets back into the webinar. Kylie, are you still here? Yes, Kylie's still here.
I am here. I just messaged Kyle to see. Oh, there he is. Okay.
Perfect.
We're back.
Excellent.
sorry about that. My Wi-Fi just just cut out. Kyle, could you just remind me where I cut out exactly so I can repeat? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry. Just at the beginning of that benefits of community bonds slide.
Oh, the benefits. Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Or sorry, the next one, the why issue.
Oh, the issue. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Um, yeah. So as I was saying, community bonds are particularly inclusive because the lowest community bond amount has typically been $500, which really ensures maximum participation from most individuals in a community. They're also particularly engaging because it creates a powerful sense of pride and ownership. A lot of Canadians are recognizing that they want to do more in terms of addressing key issues like the housing crisis. And so to be able to point at a specific building or a specific development that they helped finance is really powerful. They're also typically more efficient than donation campaigns. And in the case study section, I'll be able to share a few different examples of how these affordable housing organizations have been able to raise several $1 millions in just a few short months. They're also really in demand in that Canadians are seeking out impact investments. They're becoming more conscious of where they put their money. And so every single time Tapestry has advised our clients to launch a campaign, it has consistently sold out. And again, this is just simply due to the lack of supply of these genuine impact investment opportunities on the market. And last but not least, the community bond model is highly scalable. And so just to provide a mini case study example, SolarShare, one of our largest and oldest clients, they specifically work in the renewable energy sector. I believe they're the largest renewable energy cooperative in Canada, if not North America. And one of their first community bond issues was roughly $200,000. And to date, they've raised over $80 million in community bonds with us to scale up their renewable energy operations across Ontario. So that's just one of the examples of how community bonds have been able to allow or enable organizations to scale. In terms of how Tapestry helps, we have an expert team that guides organizations throughout the community bond process, but we also have a secure and scalable digital platform that takes care of all of the investment management and bond administration. And so a little bit more about what our process looks like from start to finish. The first stage of our process is typically a planning feasibility study. And this is where we attempt to answer two key questions. The first being whether a project is financially viable, because again, at the end of the day, community bonds are debt. So there needs to be a revenue mechanism to repay that debt over time. And then the second question that we're hoping to address is whether there is investment appetite within a given community or region for an impact investment vehicle like this. And so we go through a series of activities, including pro forma development and financial modeling to figure out what are some sample bond terms that work for your project. And once those sample bond terms have been set, we take them out into community by way of investor consultations to seek out feedback on what their return expectations are like, what their impact objectives are, and really design terms that will be appealing to the community. And once we've completed that feasibility study and have a pretty good pulse on the potential success of the community bond campaign, we can move into the second stage, which is called structuring. And this is where we do the bulk of the setup work. And so what is included in that is the development of an investor package. And within the investor package includes an offering statement. So very similar to a prospectus where it outlines all of the community bond terms available, potential risks, and risk mitigation strategies. We also help organizations craft a dedicated sales and marketing strategy on how to best engage with potential investors and convert the social capital that they've built over the years into financial capital for the organization. And last but not least, we also have our own proprietary investment management platform, as I mentioned, called Atticus, that will process all of the investments as they come in. And so once everything has been set up on the back end, we can go live with the campaign. And this is typically where Tapestry takes more of a backseat. We'll continue supporting on the investment processing, as well as fielding any PR opportunities and event sponsorships to get the word out on the bond opportunity. But it's also really critical that you as the organization are out there in community, selling your cause, soliciting investors, and getting up to your raise goal. And so once you've reached the raise goal that you've set, Tapestry will also manage the bonds for the life of the term. So what that typically includes is T5 tax slips, interest disbursements, reinvestment campaigns, and new investment campaigns. And so jumping into the case study portion, one of the active community bond campaigns we have out right now is with Redwood Park Communities, who's an affordable housing charity based in Barrie, Ontario, and they are raising $10 million to finance a portfolio of different affordable housing projects. A common misconception of the community bond is that it can only go towards one specific property, but that's not the case. Community bonds can certainly finance a portfolio of different projects, especially if it's among the same theme, like all supportive housing projects or all transitional housing projects. And grouping it in more of a portfolio fashion is actually more appealing, especially to institutional investors who are coming in at several $100,000 or even in the millions. And so another example I want to highlight is with the Kensington Market Community Land Trust, who has raised over $1 million from 146 investors to preserve affordable housing in Kensington Market. If you've been to Toronto's Kensington Market, it's a very eclectic neighborhood, but unfortunately, a lot of private developers are, buying up land, and it's becoming a very gentrified area. And so when Kensington Market reached out to us, they wanted to preemptively raise an acquisition fund so that they can be competitive with the private market. And that's exactly what we help them do, is just, again, recognizing that, when these properties come up, they could be sold within 30 days. So they proactively raised this $1 million acquisition fund to preserve affordable housing in their neighborhood. Another example I want to highlight is with Indwell Community Homes, which is a very established Christian affordable housing charity based in Hamilton, Ontario, who raised $6 million in about 3.5 months from 100 investors to support the pre-development costs on 4 different sites. And again, I think it's interesting with Indwell particularly because even before we engaged them as Tapestry, they had their own impact loan program from their community. I think, and I think this is something that we're seeing with a lot of, especially typically more rural and remote communities, where there are, passionate community members or high net worth individuals in the community who are loaning out their funds to the nonprofit or charity organization, and it was through this program, this impact loan program, that Indwell has been able to amass a little over 1,200 units in their portfolio, and so they wanted to. I think the challenge with that program in particular was that the minimum to invest was about $50,000. And so that's why they engaged Tapestry to make it more accessible, to bring down that minimum to $1,000 to make it more accessible to their community. And so it was really great to see how fast they were able to raise. Their initial raise goal was actually 5 million, but they increased it to 6 million because there was so much additional demand. And everyone wanted to, again, participate in addressing the housing crisis. So yeah, that's another example of how community bonds have been used. The last example I'll highlight is the Ottawa Community Land Trust, who raised $3 million from 132 investors to purchase 2 properties to preserve affordable housing in Ottawa. Again, this is another example where they went out with, I believe it was a 1.6 or $1.8 million goal initially for just one property. But because, again, due to the sheer demand that they saw from both institutional investors as well as individual investors, they increased the raise goal to $3 million. And they were successful in hitting it in a very short period of time as well. And I think what's interesting to highlight with this campaign is that other nonprofit organizations invested in them, particularly housing organizations who recognize that, maybe they might not have that development capacity. They do have some reserves, and they would like to kind of put it toward an organization who is actively developing or acquiring units. And so I want to really highlight the summer intake program that we've recently launched. To provide a little bit more context, Tapestry has recently started to do quarterly intake programs to make it a little bit easier on us in terms of how we plan for our capacity in terms of our ability to support organizations. And it also provides a little bit more clarity for organizations who do want to work with us to have a better understanding of what we typically look for and what are the best times, or what does that cycle look like in terms of applying to launch a community bond. And so the intake period has been from June 2nd to July 11th. So July 11th would be the deadline to submit an intake form. If you go to the Raise Capital page of our website, which Kylie can drop in the chat, you will see that there is an intake form at the bottom where you can tell us a little bit more details about your project, your internal capacity, the projected impact of the development, and then we'll review that, and I'll typically set up a discovery call afterwards just to see if there is alignment, and then we will get you to fill out a readiness assessment form where our campaigns team will review those answers and ask any clarifying questions. And then we also offer a free Community Bond 101 workshop. So for any board members or team members who need a little bit more convincing or aren't quite on the same page, it's a really great opportunity to educate everyone on the team and board on what a community bond is, what the process looks like, where it's worked in the past, and we also get into interactive activities like stakeholder mapping and elevator pitching. And so moving on to the checklist, how do you know if this is the right time to apply for the summer intake? Well, one, you would need to have a defined project, so a pretty clear picture of how many units you want and what that funding gap is. And I put the $1 million plus in brackets is just, again, recognizing that this is like the community bond process is a long process and it does take quite a bit of resources on both ends. Typically, community bonds work best if the funding gap is $1 million or more. I also recognize that, or I also want to highlight that internal capacity is a big thing as well. We typically look for organizations who have a dedicated project manager, a financial modeling lead, and a marketing communications lead. These don't all have to be full-time staff either. We've seen successful campaigns come out of purely volunteer-run organizations. It's just recognizing that you should at least have a separate individual for each of these roles who can commit roughly 3 to 8 hours per week during the planning feasibility study. And then the last couple things would be around timelines. So if you're hoping to, I guess, get all the money in the door by 8 to 12 months, that's typically the best time to start the process. If you need the money in, I don't know, 2 to 3 months, it's probably not the right fit. Likewise, if you're about 3 or 4 years out, it's a little too early to engage us. So if you need the money within about 12 months, now would be the right time to at least start with the feasibility study. And I should mention that over this 2 to 2.5 month period, you're going through those exercises that I mentioned with the pro forma modeling, as well as investor consultations. And by the end of the 2 to 2.5 months period, you will be able to get a yes or no answer essentially on whether community bonds are right for you. And so the last thing I'll mention is the existing community of support. That's just recognizing that a lot of nonprofits, charities have already built up quite a bit of a following and goodwill in their community, and there might be a lot of potential investors already identified. But for some of these newer organizations who don't have that community of support, sometimes we have seen it be a little bit more challenging in terms of raising capital. So if you are a charity with kind of an existing donor base, a lot of those donors would actually convert into community bond investors. And so a little bit more about the clients that we currently serve. I want to highlight that we're not an organization that purely serves large established organizations in urban centers. We also have several grassroots organizations in rural, remote communities, indigenous communities as well. And we're currently working across 7 provinces in a variety of different sectors, not just affordable housing, although affordable housing is, I would say, the biggest focus of our work. Just very quickly, I want to highlight some key statistics. So the average individual investment size for a community bond campaign is roughly $13,600. The average institutional investment size is about $115,000. The largest investment size to date has been by a pension fund for $2.5 million. And the smallest investment size, as I mentioned in the beginning, is $500. So again, community bonds really do cast a pretty wide net. In terms of the breakdown from individuals to institutions, we're looking at 86% to 14%. And the average rate of return for investors in 2024 is about 4%. So from an issuer perspective, raising capital through community bonds is economically smart because this is typically lower than what you could get from traditional financing. And that's what a lot of these organizations figured out, like the Indwall example that I mentioned. They could easily get a loan from the bank, but they were very intentional about choosing community bonds, not only for the community engagement aspect, but also the savings in terms of the interest rate. And in terms of who will typically invest in these community bond campaigns, we have impact seekers who want to do the most good with their capital. We also have local supporters who might be aware of your organization and want to continue supporting your efforts to expand or develop. We also have other folks who are cause connected. So maybe they might not be in your local region, but they really want to support the cause of affordable housing. And we saw this with the Endwell campaign, where they received investment from the Northwest Territories and the Yukon, and just recognizing that even though those investors might not be directly impacted by a nonprofit or by a charity based in Hamilton, Ontario, they really wanted to support the cause of affordable housing and really do their part. And then there's also folks who are more return focused, although I would say it's typically a combination of being impact minded and also return focused. When we put out an investor survey, I believe 97% of those respondents said it was always impact first, and financial return is typically a secondary reason of why they invested. In terms of demographics of people who will invest, we have pretty good representation in terms of all age groups. And then the last thing I want to mention is the reinvestment rate on these campaigns. It's typically about 70%. Again, this is really amazing to see, because if you've been able to show your investors that you pay interest on time and you're hitting your impact milestones, that this is a really great way of scaling up your your operations, getting more developments on the ground and shovel ready and getting more units up. So that initial pool of investors that you build can be really valuable down the line with future developments. And so the very last thing I want to mention is the Weave Community Capital Fund, which is our newest initiative, which is Canada's first national portfolio that lends to issuers of community bonds. And this was essentially our response to a lot of institutional investors who have always said, they're really interested in community bonds. They really like the concept, but historically, the ticket sizes or the raise goals have been a little bit too small to justify the cost of due diligence. And so this is why we're creating this $30 million fund, because it's a size that these institutional investors can get behind. And how it impacts you as an issuer of a community bond is that it can be that first injection of capital that you need to start crowding in other institutional and accredited investors. So, if you launch a $5 million campaign, the Weave Fund can inject the first $500,000 or $1 million into your bond campaign to really get the ball rolling. Or if you're nearing the end of your campaign, you've raised 80 to 85%, but have lost some steam or momentum, Weave can also be an anchor investor to kind of top up the rest of the money that you need. And again, this is just one of the strategic initiatives that we've launched to help issuers raise more capital faster, and we're currently in fundraising mode as well. So if you are a nonprofit organization with reserve funds that wants to contribute to the development of affordable housing all across Canada, this could be the investment opportunity that you look at. But there are also a lot of great local community bonds that you can purchase as well. And so we also have Realized Capital Partners committed as a lead investor. So yeah, that is the end of my presentation. I'm happy to answer any of the questions in the chat or in the Q&A section.
Kyle, there are a few questions in the chat, and then I see lots in the Q&A section.
Where do you want to start?
Should we start in the chat? Is it helpful if I read them out to you?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, great. So John asks, how do nonprofit housing providers make repayment to bond issuers when most affordable housing projects break even at best or require public subsidy to cover operating costs?
Yeah, it's a good question. Typically, nonprofit, yes, the margins are often thin, but typically there is a net positive. And Also, in the case with refinancing, CMHC refinancing, typically they can provide that takeout financing for the community bond. I will also say it kind of varies depending on like the issuer to issuer. Some issuers, especially the larger established ones, already have cash flows generating off of fully paid off properties. So that is another kind of method in which they're able to service the debt. And then the last thing I'll mention is with the reinvestment campaigns. So again, recognizing that a lot of these nonprofits and charities, especially the grassroots organizations who are raising $1 to $2 million, they might not be able to pay back that full amount in the 7-year period or the 5-year period, but maybe they pay off half the amount and then launch a reinvestment campaign for the remainder. So that's another example of how you can refinance using community bonds. And some like Solar Share that I mentioned started off with 7 years, gone out to 14, 21. So a lot of these investors are happy to come in and support and are very understanding because again, you're not dealing with a financial institution, you're dealing with compassionate individuals in your community who want to see the project succeed. So it's a combination of the reinvestment campaigns, other funding sources, traditional fundraising to in order to service the debt. But that's kind of one of the purposes of the feasibility study is we figure out what are those sources and whether community bonds are viable for your project.
Great. A few questions about the requirements for the intake. So Edwin asks for a defined project. Is it possible to have more of a portfolio approach, which I think we covered a little bit, but maybe a bit more detail on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can totally take a portfolio approach as long as within that portfolio, those projects, are defined, even if there are at varying stages, like some of them are at pre-development, others are further along. As long as there's kind of a clear funding need, I think that's what's critical because some organizations come to us, they don't really have a good idea of how many units they want to develop, and so they don't know the cost and they don't know what that gap looks like. So as long as you know what the gap is and the number of units in that portfolio, you can enter the program and we figure all those other details out with you.
Okay, great. Nick asks if we can expand on Tapestry's approach to initial validation of investor interest during the planning and feasibility phase of our process.
Yeah, so those investor consultations typically involve inviting a few different stakeholders to the table, like an everyday retail investor, a high net worth individual, a foundation, a local business, just kind of varying, I guess, perspectives is what we're after in terms of the feedback that we want from kind of an interest perspective or a return perspective. That's why we go through developing like key investor materials for you to kind of take out publicly. Organizations will typically do it in person, or depending on, I guess, the regions that you want to attract, you can also do it through a webinar. But we just really want to get a good pulse of, who are all these key individuals within your local community who will likely come in and what are their thoughts on community bonds as an impact investment vehicle. So that's typically how we gauge interest. And I think especially in regions where community bonds have already seen a lot of success, like Ottawa, like Hamilton, there's already precedent, right? And so we know that, there's a lot of committed investors in affordable housing within that local region. And so if you launch a community bond campaign in a region that already has set that precedent, then you're also more likely to succeed as well.
Okay, great. And then a few questions about Tapestry's fees. How does that work?
Yeah, great question. So with the summer intake program, which again just covers the first phase of our process, the planning feasibility study, that comes with the cost of $5,000 upfront. But how we've designed it is that if you complete the feasibility study within 2.5 months or less, you are reimbursed that full amount, the full $5,000, as a discount to the next phase of our process, which is structuring or setting up the community bond. And so our fees typically vary depending on the size of the raise, as well as how hands-on or light touch you would like Tapestry to be. But I can give you an example. For instance, on an average $5 million campaign, setting up the community bond would be roughly 1.5%. And then there is also an ongoing raise fee once your campaign is live. And Tapestry is processing all of the investments on the back end, fielding PR opportunities, doing event sponsorships. That typically comes at a cost of $2,500 per month for an average of 6 months. And then once you've raised the capital, and we're in the management phase, so the fourth and final phase, where we're taking care of the T5 tax slips and the interest disbursements, that typically comes at a cost of 0.2% per year to do all of that. And so again, like I said in the beginning, Tapestry is a nonprofit ourselves, but we do have overhead, and given the community bond rates out on the market right now, even if you factor in Tapestry's fees, you still come in a bit lower than what you'd get from a traditional lender.
A few questions. I'm going to try this answer live function in the Q&A, see if this works. Okay, I thought it would come up on the screen, but it didn't, so I'll read it out. But Ken and Jesse both ask about how bonds are secured, whether organizations need to have a certain amount of equity or security that in hand before they launch a community bond.
Yeah, so the bonds are typically secured against the property that you're hoping to acquire or purchase. The community bond investors typically come in last in line, so it doesn't interfere with other forms of financing that you might receive from CMHC or Vancity or other banks. And we highly recommend securing the bonds against the asset that you're purchasing, because it provides that extra layer of assurance for these investors. But I will also mention that if you are a more established organization like Indwell, who has a very strong balance sheet and a lot of equity and a lot of cash flow, you can kind of get away with doing unsecured bonds as well. And so that's less risk to you as an organization, because there is no there's nothing binding you to repaying those investors over time. Of course, you want to be able to service the debt and repay back your community bond investors. But if it's unsecured, you don't have that same obligation. Whereas if it is secured, if anything goes wrong, which again, we haven't had a case of default yet, but if it does happen, then the organization would just sell the property and repay back the bondholders with the proceeds.
Sort of along those lines, Patty asks or says, healthy, strong, and fiscal savvy leadership would appear to be needed to take this model on. Any partnerships with actual financial institutions, credit unions, civic or provincial or others that would allow for stable sustainability?
That is, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I mean, it certainly does take a certain degree of savviness to be able to understand, how this model could work with kind of your existing funding streams. But typically, a lot of these groups also contract out like development consultants who can do the work, or business plan consultants who can do that work for them. So there's a lot of support, and Tapestry as an organization, we're willing to work with those external consultants if they're brought on. In terms of partnerships with financial institutions, like for instance, Vancity Community Investment Bank have loaned to several of our existing clients, and they actually see community bonds as like pseudo equity. So again, because community bonds come in last in the capital stack, it's particularly friendly for other financial institutions who might want to loan to you for the project. And so, but yeah, I think especially developing those relationships with like financial advisors who might be able to push the opportunity to their potential investors, or other networks who have, especially when you're in that raise period, it's really important to see, what are those networks you can capitalize on. And so if you already have some of those relationships in the financial sector, with groups who might want to shift their capital into more impact-focused initiatives, that can certainly help this or boost the success of your campaign.
Jordan has a question about stacking community bond financing with CMHC funding, specifically the Affordable Housing Fund. And specifically if organizations struggle with the capital repayment of the bond and the impact it has on the debt coverage ratio.
Yeah, so we were like most of our funding has come from CMHC, and for the past 2 years we were in the CMHC Housing Supply Challenge. And so this is kind of an ongoing conversation with CMHC's underwriting team, because the Housing Supply Challenge team, which is more so focused on innovation and impact, is really gung-ho about our solution, but really trying to ensure that all underwriters are aware of the product is going to take time. But I don't think CMHC would have funded us if they didn't see community bond stacking with their existing programs like the Affordable Housing Fund or other streams. And so yes, it certainly impacts the debt coverage ratio, but we've heard from some initial conversations with those underwriters that if you do a 10-year community bond, which is typically when refinancing happens, CMHC will typically work with you on that. And also, if you're in the position to do an unsecured bond, that's also looked upon more favorably to CMHC, because it can, I guess, kind of qualify as like the pseudo equity to fill in those equity gaps. So that's kind of been our experience with CMHC, and I would say roughly half of the clients that we support are seeking CMHC funding. The other half already have other funding secured from either the province, the city, or just their own reserves.
Peter asks about whether we see a role for both interest-bearing and interest-free community bonds, or only for interest-bearing bonds.
Yeah, great question. So we've definitely already launched or piloted the interest-free bond with the Ottawa Community Land Trust, where we recognize that not every community investor wants a return, and they don't want to profit on affordable housing, and so we've also had cases in the past where we worked with charities, and there was a giving bond option where investors will not only purchase that bond, but will forego their interest in exchange for a tax receipt. So the interest is automatically donated back to the organization, and the organization issues a tax receipt for that donation. So if you're a charity, that could be a selling point as well. Maybe these investors aren't getting their full interest, but they are getting a bit of a tax break. And so you can totally set, a 0% bond in addition to your interest-bearing bonds. But I would say, it would be unrealistic to completely rely on the 0% bond. I would say maybe 5% of your raise goal might come from that. But typically, most investors are going to purchase an interest-bearing bond. But if you are a charity, even if they do purchase an interest-bearing bond, you can always do an appeal, especially around like Giving Tuesday or something. And we've seen a lot of success there as well. And sometimes beyond interest, these investors will also donate their principal back too.
Someone asks, is the process regulated by provincial securities commissions?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the exemption that enables community bonds to exist is a national exemption. So it's National Instrument 45-106, and specifically speaks to the issuance of debt securities by nonprofits, charities, and co-ops. So if you're a nonprofit or charity, you don't need to report to any provincial securities commission. If you are a co-op, there are a few extra steps. And so you can definitely issue a community bond, but there are a few administrative steps of reporting kind of your financial statements and reporting your sales on those bonds with the Provincial Securities Commission. So that's the only, I guess, extra step that comes with the bond campaign. If you're a co-op, if you're not a co-op, you don't have to go through the same process.
Has anyone used community bonds to raise funds for retrofit capital work rather than scaling or building new?
Yeah, absolutely. They've definitely used community bonds just for you don't have to preserve or build new units to use the model. Again, if there is a revenue model in place and you think you can reasonably service the debt on the bonds, and there's an impact component, you can use community bonds for virtually anything you want that it kind of aligns with those initial things that I mentioned.
Um, is the average interest that you mentioned 4% compounded?
Good question. So typically that interest rate is a simple interest rate, although some organizations might opt to do all compounding bonds. It really depends on I guess your development because we also recognize that um, it's going to take a couple years, 2 to 3 years, to get to stabilization and have that positive cash flow. So there have been also instances where issuers have been creative in how they structure their bonds to say, hey, the interest will accrue, but we won't pay out any interest until year 3 or year 4 of operation. And so that's one of the ways that you could kind of give yourself a little bit more runway. Or simply you could just set all of your bonds as compounding bonds in which you don't have to owe any interest until maturity, and that's when you would have to pay the principal back as well.
To what extent are racialized and Black communities utilizing community bonds?
Yeah, great question. So we've been in talks with folks like the Little Jamaica Community Land Trust, as well as Hogan's Alley Society, based in Vancouver. I think there's a lot of interest, especially from foundations, to support Black-led initiatives. And I think, just recognizing that, especially for those communities who have historically faced challenges, especially securing affordable housing, and like that is a sector that we're actively, or not a sector, but a type of initiative that we're actively trying to see how we can play a larger role in terms of engaging them and seeing what their investor community would look like. Because recognizing that a lot of the communities that they serve might not be the individuals who would invest in their campaign. And again, this is why we've launched Weave, is recognizing that, especially in certain communities who might not be able to mobilize as quickly, they need a bigger push. And so that's why we've launched, initiatives like Weave to play that role. But to date, while we have had those conversations, we haven't had a community bond campaign or a Black-led community bond campaign yet, but we are hoping to have that in the near future with those projects that I mentioned.
Jumping all over here, but a few questions more about the feasibility assessment and more details about what's included in that or what that process looks like.
Yeah, so it's essentially it's a 2.5 month period where there will be bi-weekly meetings with the Tapestry team, and there's exercises that we and templates that we share with you. So there will be deliverables almost every other week. And that first component that I mentioned with the pro forma development, in that very first meeting, we share our financial modeling template so that you can plop in your numbers to figure out whether the project is financially feasible, but also be able to design some sample community bond terms that you want to go out with. And then the second aspect of that is the investor consultation. So one component of that is developing the sales and marketing materials to distribute to potential investors. And then the other component is organizing an event to get those key stakeholders at the table to provide their feedback on, again, like the return, their interest and impact objectives. So that's typically what is involved in that 2.5 month process, is really making sure that the financial model is in a good place, that the numbers are penciling out, that you've found some sample community bond terms that work for you, and then also creating the investor materials to conduct those investor consultations. And then by the end of the 2.5 months, you'll have a yes or no answer on whether community bonds are viable for your project.
Great. Lots of really good questions. Thank you, everyone. And sorry if we don't get to all of them, but we'll give you some info for how to follow up. But another question in terms of feasibility, Jennifer asked, do you have a sense of the critical mass in terms of population size for feasibility? How can smaller communities or provinces leverage community bonds successfully? The examples provided are awesome, but it makes me nervous that they are all in bigger city centers that have larger population than some provinces.
Yeah, so a case study that I probably should have included is one with Places for People, based in Haliburton County, Ontario, which is a couple hours north of Toronto. I believe their county is only, I think, 6,000, 7,000 people, and they were able to successfully raise $850,000 within only 10 weeks. So again, I think there is maybe even greater opportunity in smaller rural communities, because that sense of community is typically a lot stronger than large cities like Vancouver or Toronto. And so we have seen success, and some of the other clients that I showed on that slide, like there's a arts project in PEI, there is a housing project in Sackville, New Brunswick. So there's a lot of other smaller rural projects that we're working on as well, and we're confident in their ability to not only engage their community but also engage others from outside the community who might want to support the cause of affordable housing.
Okay, cool. A few questions more about the community bond model in terms. So one question about term lengths. One question about if rates differ for secured versus unsecured bonds, and then how repayment is usually structured.
Yeah. So in terms of term length, it's around 3 to 7 years. And in terms of, sorry, what's the second question again?
Sorry, I shouldn't have grouped them all together. If there are, and then so for term length, typically it's different series of bonds. So you set the terms based around your project milestones and what makes sense. So each series will typically have a different term length. And then, so the second question is, are there differences in the rates between secured or unsecured bonds?
Yeah, good question. So again, if you are a larger organization who can get away with doing unsecured bonds, you can set them at the same rate because the risk of default is very, very low. But if you are a brand new grassroots organization working on your first development where the risk is high and there's a lot of investor hesitation, you might have to, and you want to go the unsecured route, which we typically wouldn't advise on, but if you did, you would typically have to provide a higher financial return just to provide that incentive for those investors to come in. But typically, community bonds have always fallen under the range of 2.5%, or at least the interest-bearing community bonds have always fallen under 2.5% to 5% interest consistently.
Great. A couple more questions about stacking with CMHC funding. So Jordan says CMHC now needs all other funding sources confirmed before you can apply for the Affordable Housing Fund. Are you able to launch the bond and raise the funds even before all other parts of the capital stack have been confirmed, even though the project might not ultimately move forward?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, with Propolis Housing Cooperative, that's essentially what they did, is they used the community bonds to cover the land acquisition and the pre-development costs all before they know whether the community bond campaign is successful. And that was a risk that we were willing to take with them in terms of structuring their community bond campaign. But I think moving forward, we really do want to ensure that if, if something were to go wrong and doesn't proceed, that you do have another mechanism of repaying the bond. And so we typically wouldn't advise, like for instance, if it's again like a brand new grassroots organization who wants to raise purely pre-development funds, like that is particularly risky, and investors don't typically like it is a significantly more challenging raise, is what I'm trying to get at. Whereas if you're a larger organization with that track record, and you have other properties that are income generating, if your project doesn't move through, you have other means of repayment. So that's kind of what we're trying to assess during that feasibility study to ensure that your risk profile is aligned with how much you want to raise and what your community looks like.
Mm-hmm. And that's something we work with organizations on too in structuring, is making that really clear in the offering documents what those risks might be. So yeah. Okay, we are I think we've gotten through pretty much all of the questions. I tried to group some similar ones together, but we have about 3 minutes left. So maybe Kyle, you could remind folks how to move forward if they're interested in applying for the intake, or if they have more questions, not sure if their project is right for the community bond model. What's the next step?
Absolutely. So if you do think you check most of those boxes that I mentioned, please feel free to fill out an intake form, and then I'll reach out shortly to set up a follow-up discovery call to kind of flesh out and learn more about the project. If you're still I guess kind of thinking through or you recognize that there are potential gaps, but you also might be a better fit down the line, please feel free to reach out anyways through our Contact Us form on the Tapestry page. And I'm happy to have a chat with you, even if you're very early stage and you're just thinking about this as a potential tool in the future. Happy to chat through your project and provide any recommendations that I see fit. And so those are kind of, I guess, the two viable next steps to follow up on. And again, I'm happy to, like Kylie put my email in the chat, so feel free to shoot off any questions that you might have that I haven't already addressed in this call.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kyle. Thank you so much, Kylie. Thank you everyone for your engaging and thoughtful questions. And I think it's right, the person who noted that it was a well organized, presented well, good questions, good answers. So thank you so much. We will be posting the recording of this on our website. So if you have friends who didn't get to see it, please send it their way, and look forward to working with you all in the future. Thanks, everybody.
Everyone, take care. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.